Welcome everyone. Here in chapter 4 we're going to start talking about exercise metabolism, and we're going to combine exercise with what we discussed in the last chapter for bioenergetics. In this particular video we're going to discuss about the energy requirements at rest and rest to exercise transitions. And so before we get into all this, let's do a quick review. And so in chapter 3 we discussed the 4 different energy pathways into which ATP is either stored or produced. And so the first one was stored ATP, right? The second was the ATP phosphocreatine pathway, or PCR for short. 3 was glycolysis, also known as anaerobic glycolysis. And then 4 was oxidative phosphorylation, or we can call it aerobic respiration. And early on, we discussed this idea of intensity versus duration. And what we mean by that is the harder you go, so the higher the intensity, the lower the duration is. So, or vice versa. So the lower the intensity, the longer the duration. And so when we put this into context, so for example, let's say you just want to move your pointer finger. And with that, when you move that particular appendage, it doesn't create more ATP. It uses its stored ATP. And almost any muscle in the human body has enough stored ATP for about 2 seconds of movement. And so let's say you want to do a 100-meter sprint or a power clean, something where it's very high intensity, right? And so you're pretty much going at your max, but the duration is very short. And so what we see with the initial movements of the sprint or the power clean is you'll use the stored ATP initially within about the first second. But to meet those energy requirements, we start moving into the phosphocreatine pathway. And so the phosphocreatine pathway peaks out anywhere between 2 to 5 seconds and lasts upwards to about 8 to 10 seconds in total length. And this is due to this is because it's a quick way of creating ATP. So let's say after your power cleans, you want to go and do a bench press, and you're doing a 4x10 bench press, or you're going to do an 800-meter run. And so at this point, the intensity is a lot lower. We're talking anywhere between 80 and 90%. And with that, that means the duration can last a lot longer, anywhere between 1 to 2 minutes. And so as we move beyond this 1 to 10 second range, we move away from the stored ATP and phosphocreatine pathway and start moving into the anaerobic glycolysis pathway. So as you can see at this point, the energy pathways are not stovepipe, but they're a spectrum. And so they're each working in tandem, but as the duration keeps moving longer and longer, the body transitions from one to the other. And so what we're showing here is roughly at about 2 minutes. That's the in total length of the glycolytic pathway. And so finally, let's say you want to go ahead and do a 10-kilometer run, right? You start off, you warm up, you're moving, and then after that 2-minute mark, you've completely transitioned into the aerobic glycolysis pathway, or aerobic respiration pathway, also known as oxidative phosphorylation. And that's what we're talking about when we look at this particular graph. Another way to look at this is dividing the duration at the 2-minute mark. Typically, anything to the left of 2 minutes, basically from 0 seconds up to 2 minutes, is going to be anaerobic in nature. And then anything to the right, greater than 2 minutes, is typically going to be aerobic in nature. The other component is when we're looking at the body producing ATP through oxidative phosphorylation, is it's not doing it all alone. Even though the majority of the ATP being produced is aerobic, there's still a small component of the ATP being produced through anaerobic processes. And again, when we're talking about the anaerobic processes, we're talking about the PCR pathway and glycolysis. So bottom line is the energy pathways are not stovepiped, but they work in tandem with each other. And this is something I want you to keep in mind throughout this video as we discuss energy metabolism. So before we start discussing exercise metabolism, we need to define what is metabolism. Powers et al. Defines metabolism as the total of all cellular reactions that occur in the cells in the body, and this includes the chemical pathways that result in the synthesis and the breakdown of molecules. And when we talk about synthesis of molecules, we're talking about anabolic reactions. And when we talk about the breakdown, we're talking about catabolic reactions. Typically, when we think about metabolism, we think about food digestion. And what we mean by this is when we eat food, whether it's a hamburger or a salad or whatnot, the food enters our body and is broken down via the digestive tract. And as the food is broken down, it's converted into necessary molecules such as ATP, fatty acids, amino acids, and other chemicals. The other side of metabolism is energy expenditure. And the units for energy expenditure, or energy itself, is going to be kilocalories, or kcals. And this is the SI unit. In English units, we talk about calories. But for the rest of this lecture, and whenever we talk about energy, we're going to be talking about kcals. We can quantify the amount of calories that the body is burning and what they're being burned for. And it's typically broken down into three key areas. The first being what we call the resting metabolic rate, or RMR for short. Also, our textbook calls it the basal metabolic rate, also known as BMR for short. And these two terms, resting metabolic rate and basal metabolic rate, are used interchangeably. The next category is termed here as feeding, also known as the thermogenic effect of food. And essentially, this is the amount of calories needed for the body to break down food. And the next set of caloric expenditure category is physical activity. And basically, this is the amount of calories that you burn through walking throughout the day, exercising, X, Y, and Z. And this is the component of the total caloric expenditure pie chart that we can affect on a daily basis. The rest, the resting metabolic rate and the feeding metabolic rate, or the thermogenics of food, these two components are static. We cannot change those, typically. And so let's talk a little bit more about the resting metabolic rate, or basal metabolic rate. And so when we look at the definitions of BMR versus RMR, there are some slight differences. Essentially, these two measurements estimate one's total caloric expenditure at rest for a 24-hour period. And so what we're saying is if you're sitting in a chair for 24 hours and did nothing, just sat there, that would be your basal metabolic rate. And so when we look at our energy requirements at rest, there's a couple of things that remain constant. The first is all ATP being produced is being produced via aerobic pathways. And again, this goes back into the concept of what we talked about of intensity versus duration. At rest, the intensity is very, very low. And so this means the body can go for long periods of time. And so this means the duration is very, very long. And because of this, this is why we can say that all ATP is being produced via the aerobic pathways. Secondly, blood lactate levels are typically very low. At this point, they're typically less than 1 millimole per liter. And finally, oxygen consumption is very low. And this is typically at about 0.25 liters per minute. And so as the body begins to move, the energy requirements change, requiring more ATP to be produced in order to help locomotion. And so let's work through an example. Let's assume that you are going from a sitting position in your chair, and all of a sudden you just started running on a treadmill without warming up. You went from rest straight to exercise. And so let's put this into a graphical format. So let's say here you're still sitting on your chair, and then this is the point where you got on your treadmill, you crank up the speed up to 7 miles per hour, and from this point on, you're on your treadmill running. Okay? And while you're running, you're keeping the speed constant at 7.0 miles per hour. And this is the same for the other two graphs shown here as well. And so here on this first graph, we're depicting speed on the treadmill. Here on the second graph, we're showing ATP supply and demand, or basically the ATP requirement at running at 7 miles per hour. And so what we're saying is, since the speed is at a steady state or staying constant, the energy requirement from starting the run to when the run ends here at minute 5, the ATP requirement stays constant. Now, when we look at going from rest straight to exercise, and in this case we're talking about running, ATP supply does not immediately equal ATP demand. And that's what we're showing here in graph 3. And so again, we're starting at rest, cranking that treadmill straight up to 7.0 miles per hour, which is what we're showing right here. And then we're running constantly at 7.0 miles per hour for 5 minutes. And so when the body goes straight from rest to exercise, it takes time for it to catch up and meet the ATP demand. And so this is what we're showing here in this green portion of the graph, which I'm somewhat highlighting in orange. And what we're showing here with this green line that I'm covering in orange is the oxygen uptake, or the VO2. And so in the first 2 minutes, the body is creating more carbon dioxide than it is in taking oxygen. And so this is what we're calling the oxygen deficit. And basically this quantifies the ATP deficit that we're seeing. And so with this aerobic activity, it is taking roughly about 2 minutes for the ATP supply chain to meet the ATP demand. And that's what we're showing here. So let's say we were able to measure local glycogen and ATP synthesis rates during your rest to exercise run. And again, here on this first graph, this is your treadmill speed. So you're at rest, you crank it up to 7 miles per hour, and you go for 5 minutes. Here in the second graph, we're looking at the phosphocreatine levels in the muscle. And so this is measured from minute 0 to minute 6. And so when we measure this into our graph of our speed, this is about right where we're at when we look at our muscle synthesis. Furthermore, here on graph 3, this is showing our rate of production through the PCR pathway. And you'll notice is it's highest at minute 1, but then it's drops and drops, and it's at its lowest rate at minute 3. And at this point, when the PCR pathway is at its lowest, the glycolysis pathway starts to pick up, and it reaches its peak at minute 2 and starts to drop off at minute 3. And vice versa, if we were to overlay a graph that looked at ATP synthesis via oxidative phosphorylation, you'll see that this would start to pick up at minute 2 and reach its peak roughly around minute 3 in order to match ATP demand through running at 7.0 miles per hour. And so what we're really trying to show with all this is within the first 2 or so minutes of exercise going straight from rest, there is this deficit in ATP production that takes some time to meet ATP demand. And so we can kind of see this here with graph number 2 with the significant decrease in phosphocreatine availability. And this is further supported by what we see here in graph 3, with again phosphocreatine production of ATP is greatest at minute 1. It reaches its lowest rates at minutes 2 and 3. And additionally, we see ATP synthesis through the glycolytic pathway beginning at minute 1 and reaching its peak at minute 2 and dropping off by minute 3. Also, these graphs show a secondary point that I've been trying to make is that the energy pathways work in tandem. Even though they peak at different rates, they're always working in conjunction with each other. And so why is this so important? So for example, if we look at the rest to exercise ratios for an untrained individual versus a trained individual, especially for aerobic, we see a couple of differences. The first is for the trained individual, they have a less O2 deficit compared to the trained individual. And this is pretty much due to a couple of different factors. The first is the trained individual have more mitochondria available. And so if you have more mitochondria available, you have the ability to create more ATP. And so this gives them a better aerobic bioenergetic capacity. Second is they tend to have better cardiovascular and skeletal muscle adaptations. And what this means is the trained individual is able to use and create ATP more efficiently and to move byproducts of glycolysis and other pathways more efficiently out of the body. And finally, what we do see is the trained individual creates less lactate and hydrogen ions. So we've covered a lot in this video. Let's go ahead and sum up the key concepts that we've discussed. First off, we define what metabolism was and what BMR and RMR is and what that represents. The transition to rest to light to moderate exercise results in increased oxygen uptake, and it takes the body about 1 to 4 minutes to reach steady state. And so this lag in oxygen uptake during the first few minutes of exercise is termed oxygen deficit. And so the failure of oxygen uptake to occur instantaneously when one begins exercise, This suggests that anaerobic pathways contribute to the overall production of ATP, especially during the initial few minutes of exercise. And finally, after steady-state oxygen uptake is reached during exercise, the ATP demand is met by aerobic metabolism. So I know we covered a lot, but I hope this helps. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'll see you in the next video. Take care.